Thank you for joining us today. Welcome to our fourth and final live stream in our four-part Giving 101 conversation series. I'm Afi Tengue, my pronouns are she, her, and I'm the VP of Philanthropy and Impact at Giving Compass. Joining me today is Leslie Pine, Managing Partner at the Philanthropic Initiative. Welcome, Leslie.
Hi, everyone.
So as some of you know, today is Giving Tuesday. It is a huge day for generosity around the world. Our goal with this live stream series is to equip donors with the right tools and knowledge to give with impact both today and beyond. Today, we're reflecting on all the things that have happened in 2020 and how they'll affect society in 2021 and what you as donors can do to plan for the next year. Before I get started, Leslie, please do share a bit about yourself and TPI.
Thank you, Afi. So nice to be with you and having this conversation about very big topics. So I joined the Philanthropic Initiative when we were just getting off the ground in 1989, so 31 and a half years ago. And it's really been an amazing opportunity to work with so many interesting donors and all different types of funders and companies and help them with their philanthropy. TPI's mission is to help funders of all types to increase the impact of their philanthropy. And we mainly do that through consulting arrangements with different funders, individual donors, families, companies, independent foundations, community foundations. We also do as much as we can to really try to promote more and better philanthropy and build the field of philanthropy. And we love the work of the Giving Compass and all that it's doing to really support those efforts. And we love being partners with the Giving Compass. It's really an important part of TPI's mission and emphasis. And the other thing I'll just say in terms of background is TPI was a standalone nonprofit for many, many years. And in 2012, we merged with a community foundation, the Boston Foundation. So we now operate as a distinct unit within the Boston Foundation. We continue to work with funders nationally and globally. We have a Center for Global Philanthropy and just continue to try to do the best we can to help funders to achieve their philanthropic goals.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. So let's dive into the first question. It is December 1st. We have 1 month to go in this year of 2020. As you look back, where do you think donors stepped up and where do you think philanthropy missed the mark?
Such a great question. And wow, it really has been quite a year. I really think it's not that hard to point to examples where donors have stepped up. I think there are just so many great examples of it. I think overall, donors have done a great job of addressing immediate emergency needs relating to the pandemic. We work with many funders and we hear about many others that have really stepped up in reaching out to their grantee partners, opening up lines of communication to learn what kinds of challenges organizations are dealing with, and then really helping those organizations to address those challenges, providing emergency grants, loosening restrictions on existing grants, allowing grants to be used for purposes that maybe they weren't originally intended for, in some cases loosening reporting requirements, just really understanding that this is a situation that is so unique and the pressures on nonprofit organizations, on individuals and families and communities are tremendous. So I do think funders have stepped up. And beyond supporting their grantee partners, we've worked with a number of funders that, and we know there are so many others that have supported some of the COVID emergency response funds that have been created by community foundations, by other entities all over the country and beyond. There are many other examples I could go into, but thinking about your second part of your question of perhaps where funders have fallen short, that's a more difficult one to answer because I think the jury is still out on that. We have seen certainly some examples of funders thinking beyond those emergency short-term needs and challenges relating to the pandemic and other events of 2020, some that are really thinking longer term and really trying to figure out what role philanthropy can play in rebuilding, reinventing, reimagining what the world can look like post-pandemic, and perhaps inviting fresh thinking about longer term solutions. I think there's a lot more work to be done in that area.
Yeah, I think I think we talked about this in our pre-conversation, but there's an exciting opportunity for us to do this all again in ways that, you know, don't leave us sitting at home in March with nowhere to go and watching exacerbated situations. Like, how do we get here? There's an incredible opportunity for philanthropy to show up in new ways, as you said, to reimagine and restructure, and to really center communities who are furthest from opportunity, who are most impacted in the solution development versus a top-down, really some participatory philanthropic opportunities, I think, is what we can hope for moving forward, so that hopefully we don't come back to this in another few years or another decade in our society. Second question. So obviously, COVID-19 and structural racism aren't going to end at the stroke of midnight on December 31st. How should donors be thinking about 2021 and beyond?
Yeah, wouldn't it be great if we could just wave that magic wand,
turn it off. Just turn it off.
That magic bullet and solve those problems immediately. Unfortunately, it doesn't happen that way, does it? I think there are at least a couple of areas where philanthropic resources can play a critical role in the coming year and beyond around issues relating to the pandemic as well as structural racism. And these areas that I'm going to talk about are certainly interconnected. But one of them, I think, is movement building. Mm-hmm. And, you know, certainly the murders of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, so many others have brought a renewed commitment and a real sense of urgency that perhaps now is the time to address systemic racism and really figure out the role of philanthropy in supporting the momentum that has gathered behind that compelling need. And you know, for funders that really are going down that path, you know, I think one of the fundamental questions is, how do you address the root causes of inequities in our society? And, you know, and how to think about social movements and the various things that really can help them to maintain and build momentum and power and strength and effectiveness. And there are so many different aspects of that. We could spend all day talking about what goes into creating an effective social movement, but certainly historically, there have been a number of different aspects of what makes movements effective. And, you know, starting with community organizing and grassroots engagement and strong leadership and coalition building, great communications to build understanding and awareness and influence public policy and start to really change structures and systems. So I think there's so much to that work and a very, very important role for philanthropy. The second area that is really on my mind so much, and I think on so many others' minds right now, especially given what's been happening in our country, is this whole question of how to really bridge divides in communities, in our country, in our world, and what is the role of philanthropy around bridging different types of divides, the wealth divide, the racial equity divide, the divides that people have in terms of how they think about our world and what's needed and what role government has to play, and, you know, so many other things. And I do think that there's a lot of long-term work that needs to be done and that philanthropy can do a lot around, including everything from strengthening civic education for young people to strengthening civil society and community engagement and really building communities from the ground up to really reinvent themselves perhaps, and, you know, thinking about what it will take to revitalize local media and nonprofit media and the roles that they have to play in informing and encouraging dialogue and really helping people to think about what issues are facing themselves, their communities, their country, their world.
Yeah, I think for me, the advocacy, the power building in communities, the civic education, I think what we saw in this past election, which I still don't know if it's over, but what I think what we've seen is just the importance of continuing to put money into long-term power building in communities of color. What delivered the election to the Biden-Harris campaign was what we saw with Navajo Nation in Arizona, what we saw with Black communities in major cities in all the very important states, Georgia turning blue, Stacey Abrams, like all of that is deeply attached to long-term power building to really activate in a moment that is of key leverage and importance within our society. I think,
and just building on that point and going back to one of your earlier questions around how philanthropy has stepped up, I think that's a great example of philanthropy playing a really important role around voter engagement, voter mobilization, democracy building, and obviously that there's a long way to go in terms of what else is needed in that whole area.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So let's move on to our next question because we have a couple more to go and we are pouring through our times quickly. So how do you advise donors who want to create a strategy, but also want to have flexibility to pivot when a major event or crisis occurs?
It's a great question. And I'm actually a really firm believer that the most effective philanthropic strategies are also very flexible and allow for and even encourage funders to be opportunistic and perhaps to be opportunistic within the context of their philanthropic goals. It doesn't mean that funders need to necessarily be all over the place and doing the term we often use as being an inch deep and a mile wide. And you know, really do encourage funders to try to get more clarity around what is it that they're trying to accomplish in terms of the changes that they'd like to see in their community, in the world. And then what are the strategies that are going to help them to move towards those goals? But if they don't allow for flexibility and being opportunistic, then I think a lot of funders can really miss out on some of those opportunities that do bubble up, sometimes in the most unexpected ways or at the most unexpected times. And this past year, I think, is a really great example of that. So, you know, I think for funders, part of it is just finding the right balance. And for some funders, it's just thinking about their portfolio of grants and what grants are really designed to address longer term issues and goals that they might have as philanthropists, and then to allow for some flexibility to address emergencies and disasters and needs that are just so imminent and need to be addressed immediately. So some of it is that finding that right balance. I think a lot of it is something we've always encouraged funders to do as much of as they possibly can, which is to really listen and learn, and to listen to people on the ground and to nonprofit organizations that are doing the on the ground work and seeing those real needs emerging, and potentially what the answers are, and both short-term and longer-term solutions. And also listening to those with maybe a lot of different perspectives on a particular issue or related to a funder's particular goals. How do they get multiple perspectives and input from a variety of sources so that they can really begin to think about what's a pathway forward where philanthropy can really play an effective role?
What we've seen recently with Mackenzie Scott and a lot of other individuals who are part of the Giving Pledge through Bill and Melinda Gates is people who are spending now or spending when they die. And there's something about that I think, particularly in this moment of great exacerbated and growing need, just looking at the number of individuals who applied for unemployment in the past week alone, this opportunity to give and to spend down, to give and close it out, to really just step up and go above and beyond the dollars that sit in your DAF that are managed by a wealth management firm, like actually like spending half my DAF, like giving it all away. Because you can't take it when you're gone, right? So it's just like, I think there's just a great opportunity for philanthropy to, and I think we've seen a lot more of it recently in this very crazy time of people showing up in new ways, and really just thinking intentionally about how you spend down to really solve problems versus spending as like a recreational activity, something that you do because you get to go to galas and you get to participate in retreats and to think about giving, but actually just giving to solve problems is something that I found exciting about 2020. One of the few sweet things that it has given us is a lot more intentional, urgent, over, above and beyond giving.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. No, and we've really seen a lot of that. And on the flip side as well, you know, so many thoughtful conversations that funders are having around how do they perhaps allocate more, go above the 5% payout or whatever it is that works for them to address those immediate needs. And at the same time, think about, well, what are things going to look like a year from now, 5 years from now? Is that going to be a time when it's also going to be important for us to reserve some resources and not spend everything down this year? So, you know, so that's again, you know, part of the balancing act, and it's different for every funder in terms of how they think about those issues.
Yeah, I think planning for the long haul for me is always what you had mentioned before, advocacy, like supporting advocacy and power building in communities of color. I'm like, oh, like long run, long range, this will show up and this will work over the long term. And so thinking intentionally about how you, I would say, bracket out the amount of money that you're going to put attached to each of your priorities. Really intentionally coming up in 2021, seeing what we've seen this past year, seeing the exacerbated need, the number of individuals, like how do we plan for the system solutions? And then how do we continue to support the food banks and the people who are hungry right now? Like finding the balancing act between those two things.
Yeah, and certainly you can't forget the role of government in all of that too. And
yeah,
you know, that's always a challenge, you know, to think that philanthropy can address all of those immediate needs. It's just not realistic. So how do we all work together to really figure out how, you know, the role of government, the role of philanthropy, how those pieces can come together, public-private partnerships.
Yeah.
Business leaders have an important role to play in that as well.
Yeah, I definitely yeah, no, I'll move to the next question. I find like what I'm excited by philanthropic dollars is that there's an ability to take risks, to try new things that we aren't willing to do with tax dollars. And so that's also something I think people should consider in moving into 2021. Like, where are places that we can take risks with individuals who are doing the work on the ground, where we can then take those learnings and bring it back to government so that we can put some tax dollars and some real grit behind it, because there is no resource like the government, right?
No, could not agree more. I mean, that whole idea that's been around for a very long time, that philanthropy is society's risk capital.
Yeah.
Let's not forget that.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, next question. Going forward, what would you tell donors that want to ensure their giving is contributing towards more equitable outcomes in the long term?
Yeah, you know, it's funny. Some of my colleagues at TPI and I were just having a conversation about this question yesterday. And so many of the funders that come to TPI for assistance care deeply about equity and social justice. They don't necessarily call it that. They don't necessarily use those terms or think about applying a racial equity lens, for example, to their work. But many have been investing in social change efforts for many years. I think this is a time of some real frustration in reflecting on those efforts, and frustration that change happens so slowly. And I think this past year has really highlighted that in many, many ways. So this question of looking to the future, I think, is really the big one. When we started up in 1989, we had some ideas around that. Our founder, who was a really visionary man named Peter Karoff, he developed this construct many years ago that we call the TPI philanthropic curve. And it really is this notion that philanthropy is a journey. Yeah. And that for some, it starts with just getting organized and, figuring out what to do with all of those funding requests that perhaps are just in a shoebox, or, just really there's no organization around it at all. For some, it's really around starting to think about focus and starting to get clear on philanthropic goals and what is it that a funder might try to accomplish with the resources that they have to put towards philanthropy. And for some, it's really thinking about moving further up that curve towards greater impact, putting strategies in place, thinking about leverage, thinking about things like collaboration and partnerships and influencing public policy and all of the things that could really lead to long-term systemic change. And, really just continuing that evolution over time. And so much of that is rooted in continually learning and listening and asking really good questions and taking a step back from time to time and reflecting and perhaps rethinking, perhaps completely revamping approaches to philanthropy. And again, I think this is a time that many, many funders are thinking about doing that exactly. And in terms of thinking about equitable outcomes, reflecting on where are we, how far have we come, why aren't we making more rapid progress towards those kinds of goals, and what could really tip the balance going forward, or really allow funders and philanthropy to play a different kind of a role, perhaps, in accelerating progress.
Yeah, I think one thing that we've seen, particularly like with the movement for Black Lives, is just there's the reckoning that's happening in the philanthropic community and the stepping back, but then also the redistribution of power and decision-making about where those dollars go, aligning funding to communities that are on the ground doing the work and grassroots capacities, and really just handing off the power and decision-making that comes with the privilege of being able to give, and giving it to the individuals who are actually in the work, and just saying, it's not my place to decide what that leverage point is, because I'm not the person experiencing this. Like I think I've said it on a couple of these at this point, like you can't solve problems you have not experienced. And so let's center our learning and our hearing and our giving. Let's put our money where the work is, and trust that those who are experiencing the actual margins of society are the best equipped to create those solutions and to navigate and narrate those solutions, has been something I've been excited to see, and I'm hoping persists in a lot of the frameworks that are out there trying to do the work, like the Donors of Color Network, Emergent Fund, Solid Air, just people who are really just fund, really changing the game of where the power sits, regardless of where the capital sits.
Yeah. That brings to mind, we for many, many years worked with a donor who was very wise about those kinds of things. And he at one point said, I really want to do something to just support individuals who are stepping up in different ways to make the community better. And he gave grants to a lot of nonprofit organizations as well, don't get me wrong, but he asked us to put together a program that became the Boston Neighborhood Fellows Program. And every year for 25 plus years, we put together a process that involved spotters who anonymously nominated unsung heroes doing amazing community work. And they weren't necessarily affiliated with any nonprofit organization, although some of them were. And out of that process, we would identify a small group, 5 or 6 every year. And the funder gave them grants over 3 years that had absolutely no strings attached. And the idea was these unsung heroes. Whatever they decide to do with those resources, it's going to either revitalize the unsung hero in terms of the work that they're doing and allow them to continue to do that work, or it's going to go into the work that they're doing in the community. Whatever it is, it's going to have positive outcomes. And so there was this real faith that that was going to happen with these grants, and it was a beautiful thing.
Yeah. So we're just about out of time. I want to thank you, Leslie, again for talking to me today. For those of you who want to learn more about TPI, you can visit tpi.org. For more donor resources, visit givingcompass.org. And please do check out our Giving Tuesday special coverage on our homepage. Give, guys, give a lot. We are spotlighting 5 nonprofits that you can donate to right now. They are aligned with our values. They are incredible, incredible entities in their communities and across the nation. Please do take a look. Thank you all for joining us. Happy giving.
Thanks, everyone.